Greetings everyone, welcome to our playlist on mastering quadratic equations. So in this video we are going to be introducing the concept of quadratic equations. So we are going to look at what a quadratic equation means. So when we talk of a quadratic equation, so I have a quadratic equation. So a quadratic equation is a polynomial equation or a trinomial which is made of the highest power 2, that is a degree of 2. So when we talk of a degree of 2, it is in this form. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So a quadratic equation is equation of highest degree 2. Therefore, the variable, the coefficients of the variable are being multiplied as a sum. So the highest power of the variable is 2. So this is our variable. These are our variables having the highest degree or power as 2, where A, B, and C are constants. These are constants, where A, B, and C are constants. So we mentioned that is a quadratic equation is a trinomial or a kind of a polynomial. So we'll look at what a polynomial means, so we'll be able to get the understanding completely. A polynomial. So we are saying this quadratic equation, it is a particular kind of a polynomial. We call it trinomial or a quadratic polynomial. Quadratic polynomial. So when we talk of a polynomial is simply an equation having various number of terms. So these terms are a sum of the product of different variables, and the variables are being summed and being raised to a particular power, which is a non-zero negative number or integer. So example of a polynomial, we have, for example, 2x plus 1. That's a polynomial. So we make mention of terms, having a terms, sum of terms being multiplied by variables. So this is now a polynomial with 2 terms. So this is a term, this is another term. Then, for example, our main concern, we are talking of a trinomial. So it's made up of 3 terms, and that falls under the quadratic equation. So for example, we have x squared plus 2x plus 1. So it's made up of 3 terms. 1, 2, 3. So this is where our quadratic equation falls, a trinomial. So this is a binomial, 2 terms. Good. So that is a polynomial as well. So like we said earlier, our main concern is the quadratic equation. So it is that type of a polynomial. We call it a quadratic polynomial or a trinomial having 3 terms. All right, having said that, let's look at the general form of a quadratic equation. Remember, in this particular video, we want to look at the introduction of a quadratic equation. We want to understand the concept behind it. Okay, so the general form of a quadratic equation, I wrote it earlier, it is ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So this is known as the general form, the standard form of a quadratic equation. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Like I told you earlier, a, b, and c are constants. Now let's understand this general form. A, B, and C are constants. Now there is something that you need to know. Now x here are our variables. So this is a variable and this is another variable. Now remember, when we write the general form using x, like I always say, x is just an arbitrary symbol which does not necessarily have a meaning on its own. A different letter, m can be used here, n can be used here, p can be used. It remains the same. We are just using x. So any kind of a variable which represents a letter can be used. Alright. Now a, b, and c are constants, like we said. You will now notice that when reading a quadratic equation, now this a, which is a constant, is also called as the coefficient of x squared. Please remember, this a is also called the coefficient of x squared. A is the coefficient of x squared. So you can be given a quadratic equation and they ask you to identify the coefficient of x squared. So the coefficient of x squared is simply that number being multiplied to x squared. So the number is always before. So mind you, the coefficient can be negative or positive. The coefficient can be even a fraction. But you need to understand the coefficient is the number multiplying the x squared. Now, the coefficient of x, remember this variable is x squared, this variable here is x. Now, the coefficient of x is b. So, the coefficient of x squared is a, that constant a, and the coefficient of x is b. So that's it. Coefficient of x is b, and of course the constant, which is just standing alone, is just a coefficient on its own. It is just c. So c is just that constant, just standing entirely on its own. So those are the main highlights. So for example, let's take a beautiful example of some quadratic equations and let's see how we can be able to identify the coefficient of x squared, the coefficient of b, and the constant c. All right, so that's it. All right, so we have 1 or e, depends how whatever you choose to call, 2x squared minus x plus 1 equals 0. So this is a quadratic equation. Now remember, it is having a highest degree or highest power 2, and we said that power is a non-zero or negative integer, a negative number, right? You will notice that the highest power is 2. That's a quadratic equation, always 2 for the highest power. So now the coefficient of x squared here is 2. The coefficient of x squared is 2. Now the coefficient of x is -1. Why -1? Remember, the negative sign is always attached to a number. Now why are we saying 1? Remember, in mathematics, like we said, if we have x is the same as 1x, but because it is 1x, we simply just leave it as x. So remember, it is -1 that is in front of the x. And of course, we have the constant, which is just standing alone on its own, which is just 1. So that is how we identify the coefficients. Because why am I bringing this? In our subsequent videos on this playlist, we'll be looking at how we can solve quadratic equations. And of course, we have several methods: factoring, formula, graphing. And of course, you need to know the coefficients, especially in the formula method, where you have to substitute the coefficients into the equation known as the quadratic equation. But that's not for this video. That's why here is an introduction to understand the quadratic equation. Good. Another example, let's call it B or 2. Now, for example, we have -3 over 2 x squared plus 2 over 4 minus 3 over 2 equals 0. Yes, there is an x here. That's a quadratic. Okay, why do I say that's a quadratic? If we look for the LCM and everything, you will notice that we'll come with a single denominator. From here, 2, 4, 2, you notice that our denominator, of course, will be 4. And whatever we have here, the 4, we'll send it, we'll multiply by 0, and our equation will still be 0. Alright, so nothing has changed. So do not be confused. Quadratic equation, it must not be in this form, it can also be in that fraction form. But what gives you an idea to make you understand that is, or this is, a quadratic equation? It is simply the degree, the highest power, which is 2. Alright, and it's made up of 3 terms: 1, 2, 3. So the coefficient of x squared here in this equation is -3 over 2. That's the coefficient of x squared. Now, the coefficient of x here is 2 over 4. And of course, we have our single constant, which is just there. Remember, this our constant is c. So in other words, we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now, can you identify a? So that is exactly what we have been doing all this while, to identify the constants a, b, and c, because those are what you are going to substitute in your quadratic formula. So our a here is -3 over 2. Our b is 2 over 4. And of course, our c is -3 over 2. Back to the first example, our a is simply 2. Our b is simply -1. So our b is not the x. No, the coefficient, have you seen? And of course, our c is 1. Now, in a more clearer manner, to round up this video tutorial on our playlist of mastering quadratic equations. So we have something like 2x squared minus x plus 1 equals 0. So this is how you compare. Look at the general form. Our a is simply 2. Our b, so now remember bx, so it means there is a constant here, and that constant, since there is no number here, the moment you identify or notice no number is being multiplied to x, or x squared, it is just 1. But here we have a negative sign, which means our b is a negative 1. And of course, our c is 1. Remember, our x squared can also be. So another example, we have negative x squared minus x plus 2 equals 0. So our a here is negative 1. Our a is negative 1. Our b again is negative 1. And of course, our c is 2. So that is exactly how you identify the constants a, b, c. Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of this tutorial on our mastering quadratic equations. Thank you so much. Remember to subscribe and make sure you watch the subsequent videos on this playlist. As you already know, I remain your boy, Prince D. Much love and God bless.